Please do sit down. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Zainab Badawi, and it's my great pleasure to be moderating this session of the Paris Peace Forum. So, obviously, the theme throughout the gathering this year is trying to find common ground in a world that's been riven apart by rivalry. And so what we are discussing in this session is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It celebrates its 75th anniversary. It was signed in 1948 by the UN General Assembly here in Paris on December the 10th. So we're just 1 month short of that landmark anniversary. And you know, as patron of the United Nations Association in the United Kingdom, I remember the celebrations we had for the 70th anniversary. And oh, how things have deteriorated in the last 5 years. So that's what we're going to be discussing. We're going to try to see how we can reinvigorate the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course was written by more than 50 countries representing all regions of the world. It took 2 years for the negotiations, and it's to serve as a common standard for all people from all nations. There were only 8 abstentions, countries like the USSR and apartheid South Africa. So you can see then that there was a very clear idea that it was something that was universal. We're going to have 2 parts to this session. First of all, I'm going to have a conversation with the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, Karim Khan, who's a very distinguished British KC, King's Counsel lawyer. And then I will have a panel discussion with 3 fighters, defenders of human rights, and see what they think the state of affairs is. And there'll be an opportunity also, there are some roving microphones in both sessions, to put your short questions to both the Chief Prosecutor and also the panelists, and do identify yourselves when you are doing so. So, Karim Khan, it's absolutely a privilege to be with you. I know you are a very, very busy man, and no more so than at the moment. You have been Chief Prosecutor at the ICC. You were sworn in June 2021, so just over 2 years. But you're no stranger to international justice. You served on just about every tribunal, going, you know, Sierra Leone, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia. You know, you have a vast amount of experience in this area, and you have taught consistently in all your speeches and interventions about wanting to put international law into action and to put international, you know, legal justice system on the front line. So what exactly do you mean by that? How can you make it more relevant and pertinent to, frankly, the victims?
Well, first, it's a great honour to have this conversation with you. I think it all stems from a basic reality that the elegance of the prose of the UN Charter or the Universal Declaration or the Rome Statute don't by themselves provide any shelter whatsoever. What they do is create architecture that has to be fit for purpose. And in terms of international criminal justice, hot air is easy to come by. What people need is to feel that those high hopes, those moral imperatives, those legal prohibitions translate into accountability and the value of every life. And for that, we have to be there. We have to be where the crimes are committed. And that's what we're doing. We're there in Cox's Bazar right now. We're there in Chad right now. We're there in Ukraine right now. And we're trying to be where people need us the most, trying to push together to make sure we're not guilty of, you know, ritual incantations and pious promises. But
is being somewhere enough? And then what?
No, it's not. It's not a means. It's not an end in itself. But, you know, very often if one looks at the cases that have failed in the court, we can also, and I said it when I was defence counsel, we can't be legal tourists. We can't parachute in with our backpack of, you know, the Universal Declaration or the Rome Statute and expect we will understand or navigate the undercurrents of the politics, the history, the religion, the ethnic issues in countries. By being there, you work faster. We have to work at the speed of relevance, but we have to build partnerships, including making sure we have people from the countries affected and from the region helping us navigate away from fake news and fiction and fabricated evidence, and to build truthful and reliable evidence, because then we have a fighting chance to make sure we get it right and we don't get it wrong.
Okay, so you talked about Cox's Bazar, where you've been dealing with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, Chad, where there are a lot of refugees from Darfur, from my native Sudan, sadly. But the one conflict, I suppose, that's uppermost in people's minds at the moment is the Israeli-Palestinian one. And you went to the Rafah crossing last week, staying on the Egyptian side. How do you think the ICC could play a role in this current conflict? Because there are a lot of people demanding, frankly, that it does.
Well, I think quite rightly so, because that's really, right now, a situation in which, from what we're hearing, what we're seeing, it's heartbreaking, it is terrible, terrible suffering that were felt by the people of Israel on the 7th of October, terrible suffering felt by the people of Palestine in the West Bank and also in Gaza today. We do it by playing to our strengths. We're not political. The power dynamics of the world, the different fault lines, the dysfunction or otherwise of the Security Council are things we can't change. But what we can do is try to make sure that justice is blind, it is, but not uninformed, that we can come to any situation realizing we don't have any agenda except these fundamental prohibitions, and making it clear every actor in a conflict has an opportunity to keep us out by simply complying with the law. And if one fails to respect the lessons of Nuremberg or the Geneva Conventions or the Rome Statute, we also have an imperative to move forward, and I think that's exactly what our obligation is.
But can you move forward? You use the words the dysfunction of the Security Council, and frankly your work is obviously made so much more difficult because there are certain things you can and can't do unless it goes through the Security Council, and of course the major powers, the United States, Russia and China, have not signed up to the ICC. So, in a sense, it does render you moribund, doesn't it?
I think we're alive and kicking, but of course we could be more lively if we could actually access the territory. One sees, for example, what the office managed to do in Ukraine. We were in Ukraine. Now, I can't enter Afghanistan, I can't enter Myanmar, and I can't enter Israel. Evidential challenges are obvious. But at the same time, there is a yearning. In fact, there's many types of demands that people see the law in action, and I think it's reaching that critical point where there's a dawning realization, and that's the area of hope after Ukraine, that a short-term approach to international justice, viewing it as an a la carte menu, you pick and choose from it, you know, when you want and you ignore what you don't like, is leading us to this very precarious position around the world, that we're on the precipice of something even darker, for even larger swathes of humanity. Now, how do we prevent that? It's actually applying the law more consistently, with less selectivity, realizing that actually, even in the medium term, it's in the interests of states and regional organizations to comply with the law, even if it comes at a short-term political cost or a short-term national cost. Because I think that's the lesson. Otherwise, we're heading in a trajectory that fills one with trepidation and uncertainty.
Yeah, you mentioned the a la carte, approach to justice, and there are many people in the global south particularly who get the feeling that some lives matter more than the lives of those in the global south, and that's something that you hear a great deal of. I do, certainly, in Africa, that, when it comes to justice or for victims, there are those who are at the bottom of the pile, and they are often those who come from what's called sub-Saharan Africa, and that, people don't really attach as much value, that they're more inured to certain, victims than in other parts of the world.
Well, that feeling, unfortunately, has a basis, and it manifests itself, whether it's the vaccine rollout, whether it's something that President Macron spoke about this morning in terms of the need to make, finance available to developing countries so they can raise and fulfill their potential. And it's certainly the area, in terms of international politics, that And I think that's something really, you know, the law, every human life matters equally. But for people in camps, in Kalma camp in Darfur, or in Cox's Bazar, or people crossing the borders in Ukraine, or Palestinians that are, you know, living under gunfire and rockets, or even, you know, Israelis that are wondering where their loved ones are, we see a reality that more attention does seem to be given to some parts of the world, and some people feel they're too small, too poor, to be visible, to be visible, and that invisibility, you know, that rendering of the invisibility of sections of humanity is a malady that needs to be cured quickly, because within it has the potential to undermine the whole architecture built up by you know, after the Second World War, including the Universal Declaration. So we've got to rise and lift ourselves to this moment.
So I know that one thing that you have done in terms of looking at, you know, current hot conflicts is Ukraine, and you've mentioned that, and you issued arrest warrants for 2 people, Putin and also the Children's Commissioner in Russia, pertaining to the conflict with Ukraine. But how do you, as the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC, go about pursuing your lines of investigation?
Well, before, I think, if I may just say another word in terms of Palestine and Israel. I mean, I've been quite, you know, active 5 days. You know, I gave up my first interview on the, I think, on the 12th of October. But it is a moment that is painful for all communities, and I emphasised we have jurisdiction in relation to any crimes in Israel committed by the nationals of state parties. And I've also been very clear that you know, Israel needs to comply with the rule of law in relation to civilians, the targeting decisions, and I reiterated the clear, unequivocal requirement that humanitarian relief must be allowed in. And in terms of Ukraine, but the same applies to any situation we're confronted, like many national jurisdictions, with a paucity of resources. One tries to make sure you have an impact. I think I always tell members of the office, perfect is the enemy of the good. They're fed up of it, but I keep repeating it nonetheless. And it's realization that we may not get all the resources we need, but our obligation is to try to have an impact. At least we can say, well, it's not as good as it should be, but it's better than it was. And in Ukraine, you know, we looked at a number of factors. I said before I was elected that the most invisible section of society are children. More often than not, they're conflated with, you know, with the civilian population, very often actually with women, and not viewed as right holders in their own right. And then you look at the evidence that what's said and done, and in the situation of Ukraine, the policy of what we're alleging as deportation of children was not hidden. It was said from the highest level, and that allowed us, really necessitated us to work in that direction, to analyse what was available, build upon it with our own investigations, and when all the elements of the offence were made out, we didn't hesitate to seize the pre-trial chamber, the judges of the ICC, with an application, and they independently, and that's very important, they independently reviewed what we did, the discharge of our own obligations, and they issued warrants. And that standard of that yardstick of the law must apply with equal vigour in every situation.
Yeah. And you mentioned, Karim, the paucity of resources, and this has been a perpetual problem for the ICC, that really you don't quite have the resources and the tools and the funding and all the rest of it to do what you want to do. So how can you make the case?
Well, I need to do better than I've done. Because, you know, at the moment I'm going around like Oliver Twist every Christmas for what is, you know, may I have some more, please, sir, and mostly it is to men, may I have some more. And, you know, we're seeking 13 million extra next year, and we've had, you know, massive inflation. And I'm struggling. It looks like it's going to be a difficult ask. I think what we have to do is show the results, that we are trying to improve ourselves. Money doesn't solve things without a strategy, without a plan, and without a focus on the delivery and impact of international law. But also to invite those that have that decision-making power to look at the world. As you've said, the world today at the 75th anniversary is more perilous and more sombre unfortunately, than it was at the 70th anniversary. And that wasn't utopia then, was it? So.
No, it wasn't. No. Thank you for the moment, Karim Khan. Can I invite some interventions from the floor, some questions? Put your hand up and the microphones will follow you. Can I see some hands, please? Any questions that you want to raise to the Chief Prosecutor of the ICC? There's somebody there, the gentleman in the spectacles, with his arm raised, yeah. If you could introduce yourself and your organisation, please, if relevant, and just keep your question fairly brief. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jaka Bizil. I'm the founder of the Cinema for Peace Foundation and also the founder of the Citizens Court, which did a blueprint trial on crime of aggression in The Hague. Obviously, it was a mock court. It was just an example, and we did a documentary about it. The question would be, how can we make crime of aggression actually an element of the International Criminal Court, and what can be changed with the UN Security Council that the ICC can do whatever the prosecutor believes needs to be done?
Okay, anybody else? Just think about your questions. Okay, while the microphone's migrating to this oh, you've got it, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Mariano de Alba. I'm from the International Crisis Group. I want to ask the prosecutor if he can briefly comment on the issue of cooperation with states. Obviously, one step is to get the consent from some states to cooperate with the court, to cooperate with the Office of the Prosecutor. But then in practice, like for example, in the case of Venezuela, which was discussed this week in the court, is that sometimes some memorandums of understandings are signed, and then the implementations of those documents take a long time to actually see results. In the case of Venezuela, for example, you agreed with the president of the country for the establishment of an office in Caracas, but that has happened yet. Thank you.
Okay, so should we take the one about crimes of aggression first from Jakob, the first intervention there? Because there has been talk about having an aggression tribunal pertaining to Russia and Putin and so on, but how can you make crimes of aggression part of your mandate?
Well, it is part of the mandate. There was a definition of the crime of aggression that was agreed some years ago in Kampala in Uganda. The crime of aggression has been activated in terms of the minimum number of ratifications needed. But because of the politics and as part of the negotiations, the jurisdictional hurdles that were put in place mean it can only be applied in a more limited fashion because of the role of the Security Council. Now, it's open for state parties to table an amendment, and I think Foreign Minister Breibroek and I think Belgium and others are actually considering putting forward a proposal for amendment, because I think maybe now it's seen more vividly that the crime of aggression would have an important part to play. But saying that, as I always say, in relation to former President Charles Taylor or Milosevic or Karadzic or Jean Kabanda, they were all brought before a court and were subjected to the scrutiny of the law without the crime of aggression. And then, if I may go to the second.
Yes, if you go to the one about states. Yeah.
So cooperation is key, and I've said repeatedly, in fact, we have a policy paper out for consultation now, a new approach to complementarity and cooperation. We're not an apex court. We don't, as a matter of law, have supervisory jurisdiction in the traditional sense of the domestic authorities. We're based upon complementarity. And I'm actually, both in relation to Colombia, when I closed a preliminary examination that had been open for 17 years, I signed an MOU with President Duque, and it's been, again, another one, a further deepening with President Petro earlier this year. And I did the same thing when I went to Venezuela. I announced with President Maduro, and noting his vociferous objections to the fairness of me opening an investigation, we agreed to disagree, and credit goes to him, that next to me at the same time we signed an MOU that shows that I will do everything I can to work myself with my office, but also with other partners in the United Nations to see if they're willing to step up. And if any national authority is willing to step up and make sure that there's no impunity, to make sure they are really trying to ensure that international obligations are fulfilled, I will step out with pleasure. And we actually have the office. I mean, we've agreed the location, in terms of all those issues in Venezuela. And in fact, I'm going to sign this afternoon, in about an hour, an agreement also with the Foreign Minister of Colombia to open up an independent office in Bogota as well to help with complementarity. So things are moving, and I think in terms of ensuring the deeper penetration of the law, the more we are rooted in the region or in national authorities, it bodes well. And of course, we have our judges and our jurisdiction as a court of last resort.
Karim Khan, thank you so much indeed. You mentioned your signing with Colombia. I know you have got a lot on your plate currently, so thank you so much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. I think everybody has benefited greatly from your insights, and thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Great pleasure.
Thank you. So we now have our panel. If I may invite my panel up, Agnes Calamar from Amnesty International, if you'd be so kind as to sit here, Gabriel Butcher from the Fund for Global Human Rights, and Kirk, thank you very much for the Legal Pact for the Future. So, very lovely to have you all. Agnes, have you finished sorting out your handbag? Yes. Agnes Calamar is Secretary General of Amnesty International, but she's somebody who's worked very much in the world of human rights. You've been quite sort of eye-catchingly, Agnes, you were Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial killings and carried out a very high-profile investigation in 2019 into the killing of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi, and you've done many things, including in 2004 you were Executive Director of Article 19, which takes its name from the 19th article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and the free flow of information. But you've been at Amnesty since 2021, and you all know about Amnesty. So what are your kind of headline thoughts? What's your overview? Here we are celebrating 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Do you think there really is, it says, little reason to celebrate?
How to celebrate after the months that we have had, probably after the year that we have had, how to celebrate. So I think we need to acknowledge that we are in an era of incredible instability, you know, force 10 in the Richter scale of human history, I will say. We are confronting an avalanche of crises, an increase in warfare, an increase in the number of victims of warfare, international conflict, which we had not seen for many years. We are looking at an increase in inequality within state, between state. I'm sure my friend here will talk far better than I about it. We are confronting a new industrial revolution that we don't understand, let alone control, and so on and so forth. So it's a perfect storm of intertwined historical pressure.
But that doesn't mean you stop trying to uphold human rights.
Absolutely. So 75 years ago, some people came together. I call them the 1948 generation. And they came up with that document called the UDHR, which in many ways is the most visionary document for the globe, for our humanity. I think the challenge we need to ask ourselves is the following. Are we prepared to be a 1948 generation, or are we going to be a 1933 generation? Just looking at the abyss unfolding and then all of us falling into it. Are we prepared to learn the lesson from 1948, which was that it was transformative? The UDHR has transformed the world. The UDHR has disrupted the world, far more than what the people who drafted it had in mind. It was a small group of states, but a lot of people took ownership of the UDHR to demand independence, to demand self-determination, to demand equality between men and women. Are we prepared to be repeating that process of disrupting and transforming the world, or are we waiting for World War III to suddenly say, oh gosh, we need to do something?
All right. Gabriella Butcher, thank you, Agnes, for the moment. Gabriella Butcher, you are CEO and President of the Fund for Global Human Rights, and you work with a lot of grassroots activists all over the world, across continents. Before that, you had a long and distinguished career with Oxfam International, for instance, and you're very aware of the situation in your native Colombia, where there are, you know, numerous violations of human rights and so on. But let me ask you this, because you work all over the world, but there are many in the global south who look and say, you know what, the UDHR, it reflects the values of the global north. It's not, doesn't emphasize the, you know, development rights. It talks about civic, political, and social rights, and we talk much more about, you know, communities and so on. So you hear this a lot, don't you? So do you think it really has got a universal application?
So I agree with what has been said. It's a visionary document, and it was an incredible consensus that came as a result of what was called a world war, but it was a war of dominating powers at the time, but it was something that spurred this intention. But it's a document that at the time was a challenge already, a huge gap in its application, and it already has an article about that intention to have the necessary mechanisms. And what has happened is it's been equated a lot with these worse violations of human rights, which is what we've been talking about with the International Criminal Court, as you were interviewing earlier, and the situations of wars. But in reality, it's meant to be for everybody's life at all times. And structural violence that was present in 1948, unfortunately, has increased over this period because, in a way, the declaration also had an idea of the state, of a state that would be able to guarantee rights. There was a right to social security, right to education, many other aspects. And all that has been eroded over all these years in so many ways by political systems and economic systems that have privileged the rights and the interests of the few. So that is the basis on which people across the world are still fighting. And in fact, what we see from the global south or the global majority is that there is high interest in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, contrary to what sometimes is thought. And there are many demonstrations of that. And the more the repressive regimes people find themselves in, the more there is talk about human rights and the importance of that as a guiding document. So we find that 75% of the population globally now lives in either very repressive or closed regimes. And those are exactly also the same places where, through studies, there was a study published in April in this year showing how with Google searches you can find worldwide, that's where the highest correlations are. And also speaking to our activists across the world, they tell us for them the Universal Declaration is absolutely relevant in their work. And in fact, we know that people get killed because of defending the Declaration. So human rights defenders, every day, more than one person is being killed across the world for defending human rights, for defending environmental rights. And it's because they strongly believe that this is something to really fight for till death.
All right, okay, thank you. And we'll come back to the work that you do with grassroots activists.
Can I just add something?
Yes.
It's not, what's important is not so much who drafted the UDHR, but who disrupted history with the UDHR. Let's keep that in mind. Yes, of course, the drafters, it was not great. But who disrupted history with the UDHR? Who transformed history? I think that's what we really need to understand. The feminists, they were not there. They were not there, but they used the UDHR. The African countries, they were not there, but the people in Africa used the UDHR to claim their independence. You know, and one of the first documents that was created after the UDHR was the document against racial discrimination. So let's look at how much it disrupted history.
There was the Indian delegate, I forget her name, Hasnat, and so on, yeah, who brought things in. So, okay, thanks. Kirk Boyd, the Paris Peace Forum is acting as midwife to a new entity that you've set up, which brings together a coalition of NGOs and businesses and interested parties with the aim of trying to get collaboration with regional courts and the UDHR. And you cite René Cassin. Tell us a little bit about your movement first, its name and so on.
Well, thank you. I think one of with the question here that we're being asked about, there's little reason to celebrate. We're hearing some things that there are reasons to celebrate, but we're also looking at where the deficiencies are. Okay, so, and I thank you all for being here, you know, late on Friday. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you one word, because that may be all that you can really retain from this. It's a 3-letter word. It's law. It's law. And what's deficient here, and why we're having such shortcomings right now, is because there was insufficient law. And if we look back at the history that she was referring to, in San Francisco at that time, and I like this 1948 moment, this was a little earlier in 45, but it was President Truman, and this is my hometown, San Francisco, and so Truman was there, and it was the closing ceremony for the UN Charter, and Truman stood up and he said, the first thing, this is a quote, President of the United States, hard to believe, said, the first thing we're going to do is prepare an international Bill of Rights. And that was their vision. It was about law, too. And then René Cassin, who worked on it with Eleanor Roosevelt, not only did he help draft it, but then he went and he served as the president of the court. And I'm staying not far from the Pantheon, and 2 days ago, I went to pay my respects to René, same as I did last year. Because René was awarded the Nobel Prize, the Peace Prize. And I think that in answer to your question, you know, and the connection with René, it points out that a lot's accomplished, but we left this other piece off. And so when you look at the next steps now, it's good for us to think about how to expand these regional courts, because they have worked. And also with the ICC, it was great to hear Karim, because it's about creating more judicial enforcement.
Yeah. I should just remind everybody, René Cassin, of course, was the French jurist who was one of the drafters of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a World War I veteran and all the rest of it. And he became president of the European Court for Justice, which is part of the European Council, which confusingly nothing to do with the European Union, which is quite a different thing. But all the signatories to the European Court of Justice had to accept that there would be legally enforceable mechanisms if they fell short of the human rights violations. And that's why you think law is so important. So how is your entity, which is the future, it's the organization?
It's the Legal Pact, for the Future.
Yeah.
And it came of the Global Futures Forum, and it's because the Secretary General has called for a pact for the future. And so there are many people that are thinking, it's the same with these two, about, okay, where are we headed, you know, for the Summit of the Future next year, and what's going to be in this pact? And so we just feel that there should be a strong legal element in that. And so if you look at this document, in the back of it, there's a map. And a lot of people are surprised to know that the regional courts are already covering over 50% of the countries today, to varying degrees, right? But there's more.
Yeah, you raise a very interesting point, because I mean the European Court of Human Rights and the African Court and so on, because a lot of people say go to the ICC, you know, take everything to Karim Khan, but actually the ICC is the court of last resort. It's only if you can't do it regionally or whatever. So you remind us of the importance of that with the story about René Cassin, who, as you say, got the Nobel Prize for drafting the UDHR. I think it was in 1968. But just coming back to what you were saying, Agnes, about the 1933 versus the 1948 moment, is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 30 articles, which are, you know, wonderful about ending poverty, injustice, and all the rest of it, but is it fit for the new age, the digitalized world, where people talk about you need rights in, you know, the digitalized, technologically advanced world that we live in today, and people do see their rights violated digitally?
The UDHR is a standpoint. It's not a solution. So let it be very clear. What it's offering to the world, it's a way of looking at the world, it's a way at looking at power, it's a way at looking at the relationship between individuals and the state and among individuals. So yes, it's relevant. It's still eminently relevant. Is it sufficient? Does it need interpretation? Does it need new chapter? Does it need a new covenant? Yes, why not? But at heart, the offer of a standpoint from which we can assess our relationship with nature, with the state, with other human beings, I think that remains absolutely valid.
It has stood the test of time. And Gabriella, because I know that the Fund for Global Human Rights, you identify people working in the area of human rights all over the world, and then you fund them and give them the tools and the resources so that they can defend their human rights or fight for them much better. So just give us an idea of how, as you've already mentioned, the UDHR is something that they are aware of, but give us an idea of how you are implementing that on the ground, some success stories.
So what we find is that activists all over the world have this clarity and this guiding principle and this declaration that is definitely a minimum that needs to be continually filled with meaning of what it means for different contexts and for you know, all the issues that were not necessarily front and center at the time. We didn't have all the awareness of anti-racism or of colonialism and its impacts, of all the gender identity. So all these issues are issues that are being discussed across countries in the world. And we, as the Fund for Global Human Rights, seek to support those people who are working in those most closed and oppressed environments. And what they're doing is already countering and seeking legislation that is aligned with those international declarations, seeking to have programs that really protect the rights of people. And in some cases, it's just about really making sure that it's known and intergenerationally, it's known that in the past, in a certain context, those rights were upheld, because it's important to remember, but also to have the imagination and the narrative of what is possible. So there are examples. There's a podcast that has been very listened to and downloaded across Latin America, talking about the story of Guatemala over the last 50 years and what happened there, genocide, mass corruption, but also how it was possible to counter it with new ways of seeing it, with new narratives. We don't have to continue in the narrative that there's always an oppressor and there's no way around it. So the declaration is a guiding principle to say there are other ways, and new narratives is what many activists across the world are using. And they need this support, which they don't get so easily. So we would want to have many more organizations like ours channeling resources to people who have those great ideas.
Yeah.
They don't need big structures globally to tell them, you know, this is where we need to invest, or this is the priority. This is really emerging everywhere, and what we need is to support.
So, Kirk, the Legal Pact for the Future, which, as I said, is just about a day old, you want to look at the whole range of people's rights, and you want to find a legal mechanism to deal with issues of ecocide, and, you know, of course, you know, environmental rights are very, very important. So just talk us through your ambitions, say, on that score.
Well, the idea is that you have a continuum of protection, like for the environment, for example, so that there are times when you want to be able to bring a civil lawsuit first in order to stop some environmental ruin or devastation from happening. But then when that fails, you need to be able to have, like the ICC, and expand and have the ecocide. So you do that across the board. And as Gabriella was saying, and I thought, it's really, this is the most important work. Those people are putting their lives at risk, and they have to have the support to get those positions and to do what they're doing. But then it's also good if they can go and talk to a judge. Because you creating rights, that's only the start. Enforcing them is equally difficult. So I think these things go hand in hand. It's a continuum.
Just to say, I mean, perhaps this might be one for you, Gabriella. It's dangerous work in some parts of the world, defending human rights and environmental rights, isn't it?
Yes, which is very strange, because in reality is fighting for the common, for the planet, for what is should be in everybody's interest, but it's being criminalized, and in many cases with the narrative of security and preserving the powers that be. People who are questioning and challenging and appealing to higher principles are linked to criminals rather than upheld as fighters for justice.
Yeah, and as you well know, Agnes, Article 19, people speaking out, the right to criticise your government and so on is very perilous.
Absolutely. I mean, freedom of expression, freedom of association, the right to protest are under threat, and they are under threat everywhere. We have seen that over the last months, where various forms of protest in the context of the conflict right now in Gaza and Israel have been silenced. We have seen over the last decade an acceleration of the muzzling of activism, civil society, and the implication, I will say, or the impact of those actions by government is a radicalization and anger. I have to say, if there is one, I don't know about you, but for me, one of the characteristics that I find more and more when I travel around the world is a rising anger. Anger among the youth, anger among civil society, anger among human rights activists. It's very, very striking. We are radicalizing entire generation right now through very ill-fitted, ill-suited repressive measures, through an environment that leaves no legal recourse, that leaves no avenues for expressing dissent. That's going to explode to everyone's face, I should say. That is, to me, one of the clearest dimension of our era, the radicalization and the anger.
Sure. Okay, we've got some minutes for interventions from the floor. Yes, there's a lady here in the front in the colourful dress, and there's a gentleman at the back. Are there two microphones? Maybe you could give a microphone. Yes, please do introduce yourselves and your organisation if relevant. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Julie Pizzetti. I'm with the International Centre for Journalists, the International Fund for Public Interest Media, and a Professor of Journalism at City University in London. So I've introduced myself very thoroughly. My question is about, it actually flows on from something that you asked, Zainab. It's about the ways in which we're seeing our human rights eroded in digital contexts, and the apparent failure of the systems that have been established since 1948, for example, to defend those rights in those contexts. And I'm particularly focused on the safety of journalists and women. And I see through my research and my practice firsthand the hideous gendered disinformation that is directed at women journalists as a way of exposing them to increased risk, for example. And I see the radicalisation of networks of actors, whether it's networked misogyny that we're talking about, or race or ethnic-based hate which leverages misogyny. This, to me, represents a really significant threat, but also a signal of broader threats to society that we can trace back to this vile misogyny online. Beyond misogyny as well, the other threats. Can I get you to perhaps comment on that and how we can be radical ourselves and to ensure a realignment, to disrupt the malign impact of tech oligarchy, for example, to ensure there is human rights retention?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I think you said Professor. Yeah. Second question. There was somebody at the back.
Yep.
Yep. Go ahead.
Sorry. Thank you. My name is Khaled. My question is to Madame Agnès. Last year, your organization issued a very important report about the crime of apartheid being committed by Israel, the occupying power in Palestine. Nowadays, an ongoing genocide is being committed in Gaza. More than 4,000 children have been killed. What is your vision towards human rights, international law, and justice in Palestine when these articles are not even applied in these times, and when Israel, the occupying power, has not been held accountable for all its systematic crimes that have been committed against the Palestinian people? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Another question, yes, at the front here, and then we'll take three, and then I'll come back to you. Actually, while we're waiting, you're on your feet, so go ahead, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm Shabir Tajbaksh, and I teach human security at Sciences Po. I wanted us to address the politicization of human rights and how we have actually discredited it by using it for political means. And I'm thinking specifically about the choice of, for example, going for political rights over development rights, even though in UDHR, they're all there at the same time. And for example, the Nobel Peace Prize. I'm myself Iranian, so I'm very happy that, Mohammadi got the prize. But this is the prize for, for expression, versus the women of Afghanistan, who was the second leader. They don't have the right to movement, to work, and the women of Palestine today don't even have the right to live. But we have been very much stressing on the kind of political freedom. So have we not delegitimized human rights by using them for political means? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. A good selection of questions there. Agnès, I mean, two really were directed more towards you with the digitalised. Well, you also may wish to answer that on online misogyny and the other points that the professor raised, and then also Khalid's point about the issue, the report you published.
Let me begin maybe by responding to your point, because it's spot on. 75 years of human rights development, 75 years of polarization, more or less, over human rights, and division between civil and political rights pushed forward by the Western Bloc and economic, social, cultural rights pushed by the others, shall we say. We have not found ways within the international community to repair that schism that was created by political actors. We, human rights organizations, have really campaigned against it and, insisting on the universality and independence of the human rights vision. But the politicization of that agenda by either blocs, I will have to say, has made that point particularly difficult to push. And it is reflected right now in the double standard that we are witnessing, the Western Bloc demanding that we all rush to the defense of Ukraine, as we should, because Ukraine has been aggressed by Russia, and there are unbelievable suffering in Ukraine, and at the same time telling us not to act on the multiple bombing and absolute suffering of the people of Gaza. The double standard of those governments, you know, to me are the bigger threat to human rights right now. Because at heart, human rights, as I have said, is a standpoint. It's a standing point. It's how we want to look at the world, how we want to look at our relationship. And when we are saying, well, actually, that standpoint only applies to some places and not to others, we're killing the vision. So those countries that are pretending to be in love with human rights are actually part of the threat to human rights. You know, so I hope I'm answering your question. Amnesty International right now is calling for a ceasefire, along with a large number of humanitarian actors, along with the majority of the state right now in the world, because we want to put an end to human sufferings. Because suffering and our standing by victims must be universal because it is absolute. Let me add, this means standing by the Israeli victims on the 7th of October. Our standpoint must be absolute with the victims. And that is not happening, and that is killing the human rights agenda.
I just want to bring Gabriella and Kirk in. Thank you, Agnes. Gabriella, you heard the 3 points.
I would think, no, very well said. And just to say from another angle, speaking about the tech billionaires or those new powers that actually transversal to states. So what we're talking about is these double standards that are now more apparent. I think they've always been there, but now they're flagrant, and this is part of the anger that you were talking about earlier, Agnes. But this other form of power that has been invisible but has risen and is now out of control in many ways is part of this closing of civic space that is happening in the cyber world. So we see what the repression that can happen physically, and there's been action against it, but it's extremely difficult, and that's where the violence happens. But then at the cyber level, there's another level of control, surveillance, that is encroaching on all of us, and the only way there is regulation and really understanding what is at play and how it's connected with legal frameworks that are reducing the rights to participate, to freedom of expression, and also with narratives that mean that citizens in many parts of the world then think this is actually something that is desirable because of their own security. So it's actually sold as something that people give up their own freedoms and their possibilities of realizing their rights in exchange for security.
Kirk, do you want to respond as to what kind of approach the legal pact for the future might have to the kind of challenges that our speakers have just raised?
We have a saying, and that's more courts and fewer reports. Okay? If I imagine that many of you have been involved in the human rights world for many years, just like the panel here, and you see time and again things are created, but they aren't enforceable. And these reports can be very valuable. There's no doubt about it. But at the same time, I think that one of the answers is, if there's a violation of free speech, and you happen to be in some Central American country, or what are you going to do? You're going to go to your lawyer, and you're going to say, hey, they're violating my free speech. I want you to help represent me. And what's she going to do? She's going to go down to the courthouse and talk to the judge. And if that doesn't work, then they're going to go up to the Inter-American Court, which happens to work very well, but it's underfunded. It's the same thing with the ICC. So my answer would be that, and this is something that we believe on with the legal pact, and that it's really, the legal pact, by the way, it doesn't claim to have a perfect answer to these things. That's why when you look at the 4 figures on the back of the book here, you know, that represents people, NGOs, businesses, and governments all doing something together. But you could build courts in the African continent that are commensurate with the court in the European court. You know, you look at that, their infrastructure is so woefully inadequate, and people wonder well, why can't they, get over
They
this?
lack resources.
And they lack the resources. And the same for the Inter-American Court. So I would say $100 million to each of those two courthouses. That's
Good.
what I would say.
Thank you. There's a question here. Microphone to the gentleman with his hand raised. Any other points? And there's one there. We'll take those last two and then we'll wrap. Thank you. One there, just one there. If you put your hand up again, the chap at the back, so that the lady can give you the microphone, the young lady. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much.
Introduce yourself.
Yes, Stuart Patrick, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's wonderful, really wonderful panel. I wanted to ask a question which perhaps ties in with this question of some folks like civil and political rights and other people like economic, social and cultural rights. I'm wondering if you could give an assessment of the UN Human Rights Council as well as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in terms of their ability to try to hold member states accountable, not least given sometimes problematic composition of the UN Human Rights Council. One possibility is that the universal periodic review is maybe the most important thing, but perhaps special rapporteurs as well. So I'd love to get your assessment of those instruments that it has at its disposal. Thank you.
Thank you. And then our final point from the floor.
Ben Hurlbut, Arizona State University. I have a sort of conceptual question, and it comes out of a sort of skepticism at the three-letter word as a solution to the problem. It seems to me that we're in a period of at least a kind of degeneration of democracy, if not of full-blown democratization, which lies not just at the level of states and the people that run them, but also the polities that are within them. And doubling down on the promise of law and its bureaucracies as the solution seems to me to actually be at odds with the notion of human rights as a standpoint and as a mode of political imagination and action. And so I wonder if you would comment on the fitness of human rights, and in particular, the kind of legal imagination of human rights, as opposed to as a repertoire of political imagination, and where the right locus of action and reinvigoration of this 1948 vision lies.
Thank you. Let's take that question and put that to you, Kirk, and if you could incorporate your closing thought with that answer. So a bit of a challenge there to you.
But no, actually, it's just what I was thinking. I would like to use his question in order to lead in and answer his question. Because I think that my answer to you would be, well, if you look at the council, and you look, and I'm a big fan of the council. I've been going to the council for 17 years, every year. Okay, so I think that there's good reason to be active, but it is woefully inadequate. You look at the Universal Periodic Review, for example. I like that it's done, and I'm in favor of it, but it is just lip service a lot of the time, like Kareem said, And so I think it's important that you actually have courts, and that's what I would say. When you talk about whether or not law can serve for human rights, I think that there are a lot of times when it's the best recourse. It's not perfect, but even if you look in the United States, for example, we're going through a real tumultuous period here, but with Trump, when he tried to throw out the election, it was law that stopped him. He realized that. He lost 62 cases, including people he appointed. So that's an example of how it can work. Sorry,
No, that's fine. That's great. Thank you. Gabriela Bucher, any thoughts on the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Volker Turk, Austrian, of course, and the Council, and also...
Maybe I'll leave that to Agnes. But I was just going to say on the law, I think the law has a place, but the scale of the violations, systemic violations of human rights, are, in my view, not addressable by law. So we have widespread famine, we have migration, we have problems that are beyond what could be tried in courts in terms of realizing the rights for people on the ground. So it's more, there's a combination of strategies that need to be taken into account, but it's more, from our perspective, there's a lot that can be done through really having the right enabling environment in countries, so in the sense of the rule of law in general, but basically the ability to really have an open society where there is participation, freedom of expression, and where the basic rights are realized around health, education, economic rights, social, cultural rights, but also that you can defend them by speaking up.
Thank you, Gabriella. And your closing thoughts, Agnes, incorporating those 2 points about the limits of the law and also the effectiveness of the Human Rights Council.
These are super difficult questions. So first of all, with the limit of the law as the human rights vision and imagination, it's not so much the law, it's justice. That's where the imagination must be. The law is a tool to get to justice. There may be other tools, but to me, the imagination that you are asking of us must be in delivering justice. And I believe that the law, the legal framework, can be a superb tool, but it can also deliver inhumanity. It can deliver what's happening in Gaza right now, because the occupation and the repression is extremely legalized. It can deliver the Holocaust, because that too was extremely legalized. So we can deliver through the law inhumanity, and we can deliver humanity. So I think we need to really focus on having a vision for justice. And I'm a strong believer in the regional court. I believe that we have been a little bit betrayed by the international court. I'm sorry that the ICC prosecutor is not here. But 20 years, 5 indictments? Yeah. That's not a recipe for international justice. It's a recipe for turning away from international justice and looking for other instruments. So there is a need to reform how we deliver justice, because 5 indictments at I don't know how many billions over 20 years, that's not enough. And Palestine is still waiting for its investigation. So let me just say, I just want to just add one thing. Yeah. You ask about vision. Resist, challenge, disrupt, construct, and transform. That's where we should all be working towards. Thank you
so much indeed, Agnes Callamard, Secretary General of Amnesty International, and Gabriella Butcher, CEO and President of the Fund for Global Human Rights, and Kirk Boyd from the Legal Pact for the Future. I think you've done a terrific job in taking stock of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years on. I'm always heartened by the fact that I think it's the most translated document existing in 500 languages. So there's hope yet. Thank you to my panel. Thank you to you for taking the time to join us. Goodbye.
Thank you, Agnes.